All right. So, hi, Miami. This is weird for me. I'm used to being in Zoom meetings with people in government or in Congress, and now we're all in person with pink lights, and Floyd Mayweather was on stage when I was trying to get backstage, and it was a whole thing. So, we've got the very ambitious panel title, Bitcoin Makes the Law, which, gosh, I wish that was true. I hope that was true. But I was trying to find a way to sort of bridge the gap and make it make sense for this audience and for this panel of esteemed legal experts. We've got some of the best Bitcoin legal minds at some of the big companies and some of the best firms. So, and, you know, I was walking on the beach because we're in Florida, and that's glorious, and something came to me about Bitcoin making the laws. Beaches have historically, in the law, been public spaces. They are shared infrastructure because they're the easiest way in most parts of the world to walk, you know, pre-roads. We're talking Roman law. And so in ancient Roman law, and this isn't codified law, this isn't legislation, this is the organic natural law that smart legal scholars found that emerged from the bottom up. In ancient Roman law, beaches were res publica, which means affairs of the public, of everyone. And Bitcoin is actually more like a beach, more like this shared space where we can congregate and travel and accomplish our needs as a society than it is like a private parcel, like a corporation or anything like that. And so just as the ancient Romans in the institutes of Justinian had to come up with sensible law with a recognition of the reality of the beach, we, esteemed lawyers or policymakers, we're going to hear from a congressman and a senator next, need to come up with reasonable laws that we can discover to apply to this other thing that just exists. It's just out in the world now. Just like beaches, it's not going away. Bitcoin's not going away. So how can we find an elegant law to apply to this rather than try to impose law? So Bitcoin may not make the laws, we'll discuss, but at the very least, we need to find law to allow Bitcoin to flourish because it is a shared public infrastructure, because it's something we're all working together for. So again, our panelists today are, from my right, or from your right, Teana Baker-Taylor, who's general manager of Crypto.com UK and formerly of Binance. Jeff Horowitz, who's CCO of BitGo. Hailey Lennon, who's a corporate attorney at Anderson Kill, one of my favorite law firms. I don't know if you all have a favorite law firm, but I do. And finally, the unstoppable, the dean of crypto law himself, Marco Santori, who is now CLO at Kraken. It's a good panel. It's a very good panel. So I wanted to just, you know, we only have a short amount of time, and I wasted some of it talking about the Emperor Justinian. I want to get to brass tacks. What are the real threats to Bitcoin? What are the real threats to this public infrastructure? You know, in ancient Rome, the beach, because it was public infrastructure, was something that no man or woman was to be forbidden access to. It was something that had to be open to the public. Even the emperor, in a certain sense, wouldn't be able to make sure that no one reaches the beach. How do we come up with reasonable rules to ensure that Bitcoin as shared infrastructure is always available to the public? And what are the biggest threats to that mission, if you will? The first thing I want to ask you guys about, and I want to ask, I think I'm going to start with Jeff, is anti-money laundering policy. So there's been some talk of KYC, AML. FinCEN, which is the part of Treasury that does anti-money laundering policy in the US, has recently proposed some new rules that might be worrisome to folks who are trying to start Bitcoin businesses or just use the network. Tell us about those.
Sure, thanks. So FinCEN came out at the very end of December, you know, over Christmas break with some proposed regulation that we had a comment on. And really what it was requiring exchanges to do is share personal information about their customers and their transactions. But it went even farther. It actually asked for exchanges to share information about who they're sending it to or who they received it from. And from a privacy perspective, that's a major risk. If you can take publicly or PII information, personal information about your customer, send that to a government or send that to another exchange, the permissionless and the open nature of the blockchain for Bitcoin, you can re-engineer and figure out who owns what crypto. And so as an industry, we came together to really comment on why that was not the right way to go about this. And luckily, we had 15 days to comment. We got a reprieve, and a new administration came in. And so we have another chance to go back and partner with the regulators and explain to them why that's not a great avenue to pursue. Brian and Chris talked earlier. We can't outrun the regulators. We can't ignore them, even if this is a peer-to-peer network and can operate without intermediaries and without regulated entities. If we really want the pie to grow, we need institutional adoption. We need more people to come into this ecosystem. So we need to work with the regulators on educating them first and figuring out a sensible regulation to both manage the risk of money laundering and terrorist finance, which is real, but with the promise of a permissionless blockchain and an open financial network where everybody around the world can participate. We're going to talk about how do we bring the unbanked into the network. This is one way we can do it. And if we have stifling regulation, we're never going to get to the original goal of what the Bitcoin white paper was all about.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, because I think, Jeff, you'd agree that this is a step beyond what normal financial institutions need to record about their customers. Because normal financial institutions, they record information about their customers.
Yep.
They don't ask, who are you going to take that $100 that you just withdrew as cash, and who are you going to give that to? That's a step beyond. That's a step where we're asking financial institutions to be deputized elements of surveillance for the state, not just about the people that they already have business relationships with, but complete strangers, and amassing private information about them, like Bitcoin addresses and personal names and physical addresses. It's like, it's what someone who wants to commit extortion would love, is that data.
I mean, these are non-obliged entities and counterparties. They didn't agree to share their information, and the way the proposal read, we would have to do that. So I'm hoping that cooler minds prevail. We have ongoing dialogue with Treasury. We have a new FinCEN director who actually came from chain analysis, so he actually understands what the risks but what the benefits are and the promise. So I'm hoping to continue that dialogue and that we come out on the other end, that we have a balanced approach to manage risk but allow the promise of what we're all here about can actually come to fruition.
Yeah, this is something that maybe a lot of people who aren't closer to government may find surprising, is that there are good partners in government who actually do love this tech, even within the bureaucracies, even within Treasury, within FinCEN. And there were folks who I know weren't so happy about that proposed rulemaking when it was being rushed by the prior administration. We were given 15 days to comment on this rule from December 15th onward, so right over the Christmas holiday. And it was this attempt to make it final before the Trump administration got pushed out. And this isn't about Democrat or Republican. This was about one Treasury Secretary, frankly, Steve Mnuchin, who wanted this done on his watch, and he knew he was leaving. And fortunately, it got slowed down, and maybe what we're going to get, we still don't know, will be a little bit better. So with that, I want to move on to another anti-money laundering threat to crypto. Specifically, it's another F word, FATF. The Financial Action Task Force. Teana, you've done more work internationally. Can you tell us a little bit about what FATF is, and what was the recent guidance about that was a little bit concerning?
Sure. So the Financial Action Task Force has been around for about 20-ish years, and their role is really a global standards body. So they're not a regulator. They make recommendations. They have about 120 member countries, and they advise on how to put policies in place that prevent money laundering and terrorist financing, in a nutshell. 2 years ago, they came out with guidance whilst the Americans had the presidency of the FATF, so they were overseeing the FATF, that looked very similar to some of the requirements that we have in the US for banks from FinCEN. And they wanted to apply all of this to crypto firms, and they call them virtual asset service providers. So the term VASP is something that you might hear. And a long story short was anybody that was sending or receiving Bitcoin across any network was going to be responsible for providing all of the information that could be attached to that transaction. Now, we know that a Bitcoin transaction...
Individuals, not even corporations, not even exchanges.
No,
potentially individuals.
Any transaction $1,200 or more, the equivalent of. So, and unhosted wallets were excluded from this, right? So if you had your ledger and you moved money from Coinbase to your ledger, then that would kind of be off the cards. So implementing the travel rule, as it's known, and all of the information that is sent. So usually when you send a wire transfer, you know how you fill out this form and there's all of this information, who you're sending it to, your account details, all this stuff. You can't attach that to a Bitcoin hash, right? So how are we supposed to even record this information and store it? And who's responsible for storing it? And it really brought up a number of privacy issues. And as Jeff and I were talking earlier, like, you know, a potential honeypot where all this information sits, and it was just crazy.
Yep.
So there's a number of things that have been put in place to allow these VASPs to be compliant with this travel rule, and it's being rolled out across the globe, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So what that means is your trading platform may ask for information from you that they didn't ask before. Most trading platforms in the US probably are asking for this information anyway during your onboarding process. But recently, they've come out with new guidance that has expanded that list of VASPs to a really extraordinary cohort of players within the ecosystem. And they're also, again, talking about unhosted addresses, which raises a lot of concerns. And so there is academia and different industry bodies. There's an organization called TRISA that is working on a solution to potentially exchange that personal information under a zero-knowledge proof so that it's encrypted. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work.
Hopefully it helps, right? But should the information even be something that's reasonable to demand an individual, not a business, to actually send? We don't ask people, did you pay $100 in cash to the local bodega? Please tell the IRS, please tell FinCEN about that transaction as it happens in real time.
They're trying to bring that $1,200 down to about $250, I think it is, Jeff?
1,000 and 3,000.
Okay. So, so they're trying to lower the threshold. And no, if you're asking me personally, do I agree with that?
Yeah.
No, I don't. But there does come a point when, if this is going to happen anyway, working within the system to achieve the best outcome for the community and for Bitcoin overall, is there a way that we can try and come up with solutions that use this technology that we're so passionate about to solve this problem that retains our privacy? And I do think that if we focus on it, it is possible.
Yeah, it's the right question to ask. I think what worries me most, though, is we're seeing this expansion of financial surveillance laws that previously only applied to big banks. And you can be upset about that in itself. It's amazing you have no Fourth Amendment right to your bank account records. None. Government can go to your bank and say, tell us all their transactions, no warrant required. But to extend those kinds of surveillance obligations, not just to banks and their customers, but to individuals using the Bitcoin network as individuals, just as themselves, to me, that's a step too far. And at some point, our Fourth Amendment rights, matter, I think. So we're going to switch gears now away from anti-money laundering and the Fourth Amendment to talk about secondary market regulation, which sounds like a really exciting topic. Now, in the US, this is a complicated area because we've got state money transmission licensing laws. Like some Bitcoin companies might be Florida state licensed money transmitters. Some might be state chartered banks. Some maybe one day, and actually some are, federally chartered institutions. So Hailey, why don't you give us a lowdown? Like, what is the goal of this secondary market regulation, and why in the US do we have so many types, and is it helping?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I started my career at Silvergate Bank about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, and back then the only option companies really had was to go state by state, get money transmitter licenses. The BIT license was, was evolving. I think it's a great thing that we now have these different options. Companies come to my firm and aren't just asking for help getting those licenses, they're asking what their options are and what the best course of action is. But what all of the oversight is really looking to do is a supervisory role and ensure that there are consumer protection elements in there, that companies are well capitalized, that they have a compliance program.
There's like fingerprinting, right?
I'm sorry?
There's fingerprinting of management and directors, right?
Yeah, there is. The process of actually getting these licenses is very tedious and expensive, but there are different options now. I mean, Marco with Kraken, there's the Wyoming option, there's the OCC charter. So the thing that I always tell clients that come to us is like, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you looking to be an exchange? Are you looking to just be a custodian? are you wanting to just have one regulator, but on the federal level, and have it be a very, possibly a more difficult regulator than state by state? But then you don't have to have this like 50 state patchwork.
It sounds like all these different forms that you could take if you wanted to start an exchange. It sounds like a great amount of work for lawyers. It sounds like it's like let me show you the world. You have so many choices, and we've got a lawyer who specializes in each.
It's a job security thing for sure, for sure. But I don't think that that's the purpose, and it's something I'm really passionate about. I was at Coinbase, Bitflyer. I think regulators, and it's probably an unpopular opinion in this room, but regulators sort of get a bad rap. They really are here trying to figure out the space. They may move slower than we would like. They may view privacy in not the same terms as we do and not be as fond of that. But at the end of the day, all these regulators are trying to understand the space and make sure that consumers and users of this technology aren't harmed in the process.
And I realize I might have seemed a little bit down on America earlier because I was talking about financial surveillance and the Fourth Amendment, but I think the secondary market regulation question is one area where U.S. kind of shines, interestingly, because we've got all these different levels of government. We've got federalism, we've got state governments, we've got federal governments, and even within the federal government, we've got like 5 different prudential regulators. You've got the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC. You're all fascinated by this, I'm sure. But you've got so many choices, and they have to compete with each other. It's not exactly like full market competition, because they're all, elected or appointed instead of chosen by buying and selling, but it's something compared to maybe a European approach where you're going to get one pronouncement as to how these things are regulated, and that's it. If you don't like it, you're kind of screwed. Marco, you're at Kraken.
I am. I am. Thanks for bringing it up. I'm a big Kraken fan. I have a Kraken account. We actually just launched a retail product, so you can buy
all right.
Oh, did you not want to do that? Okay, great.
But what I want
Let's
to
talk
ask you
about secondary market regulation.
What I want to ask you about Kraken is you guys have changed your secondary market regulator in a sense. You've got a new form. What are you getting from that? What is it, and what are you getting from that?
Kraken Bank. Kraken is the first recipient of the Wyoming Special Purpose Depository Institution Charter, SPDI Charter, which is a state bank license. There are lots of other state banks out there. State Street, for example, is a large custodian bank. They are a state bank. It was a decision made by management, really, faced with a menu, right, of decisions. There's so many different ways of going about it, and they each come with different benefits and different obligations. Kraken chose a state limited purpose bank. So the state bank charter allows us to do a lot of cool things, like take custody and deposits of your cryptocurrency, which is not something most banks do. It probably could, it's just not something that most banks do. We can access the federal payment system, the clearinghouses, which is something that some banks cannot do.
Well, and this is a perennial problem for exchanges, right? You may have access to the federal payment system because you've partnered with a bank, like a lot of exchanges partner with Silicon Valley Bank, or there's a handful, Silvergate, that will do that kind of relationship work with an exchange. But if they ever don't want to do that work anymore, the exchange is kind of SOL, right?
Absolutely. And every exchange in the country is this elegant stack of you talk to the engineers, they explain it differently, right? But it's an elegant stack of software that is customer first. We serve the client at all costs, except for this teensy-weensy little part of the stack that is at the very bottom of this enormous pyramid, and that is the bank, the payment system. The payment system sits at the bottom of the stack. If you've ever had a problem with Kraken or any other exchange out there, chances are it had something to do with a fiat payment that was coming in or out. That is the most challenging part of running an exchange, at least in terms of business challenges today. So what Kraken decided to do was to bring that in-house.
Is it helping?
So far.
Yeah, because this is interesting. So like we were just talking about WikiLeaks and the internet. There's this idea of the internet routing around damage, right? And you could look at the legacy payment system as damage because in a way it is. It's very broken. It's fragmented between banks. Settlement sometimes takes 3 days, sometimes even longer, even though you can send a text message of a cat in 3 seconds. And it relies on these intermediaries who, if they don't want to transact with you, if you don't want to, if the intermediary doesn't want to fund a nonprofit like WikiLeaks, that nonprofit ain't going to get funded. If Baisol in Belarus doesn't want to, if the banks don't want to let them raise money for pro-democracy protests, they're not going to do that. So we've got this damage as far as financial freedom in the world, because these are legal causes that people might want to support, like democracy in Belarus.
But you have constructed the perfect lens in which to view the difference between a permission system on the one hand and a permissionless system on the other. Permission systems do not route around damage. The damages are either politically caused or politically prevented.
Yep.
Permissionless systems, like the internet, like crypto.
I was going to say stable coins too, because that's been a solution to the banking problem.
A terrific example, right?
Yeah.
Because that demonstrates the adjacency of those two systems. And the permissionless systems allow anybody in the audience, you can go out there and you can code. You don't have to apply to Kraken. We'd like you to, because we're hiring, but you can go out there and you can write open source code. You can contribute to an open source project. You can route around the damage. You can do it yourself without anyone's permission. That's something magical. That's something that's only happened in the last few years of finance. This entire football field of history, we are but a blade of grass on the 1 yard line right now.
Although
it's very powerful.
The other thing I always think about is we're just at the beginning of changing it, but we're also just at the beginning of it being a problem on some longer time scales. So before 1970, most of your transactions would have been done in cash, and those would have been person-to-person transactions. And then gradually, as credit cards and other things become more popular, everyone's doing electronic payments. And after 1971, 72, we have the Bank Secrecy Act, which means there's full surveillance of all of your electronic payments. And now that you do all of your payments electronically, there's full surveillance everywhere. So that's the thing that's new. For most of America's history, there was a peer-to-peer economy that was not surveilled, and we weren't a bunch of lawless criminals, generally speaking. And so maybe now we can rebuild that system, and I actually am pretty optimistic that we won't be a bunch of lawless criminals once we're fully peer-to-peer with Bitcoin and things.
Well, and one thing I think is interesting is crypto companies are sort of meshing into the banking world. There's this idea of Bitcoin sort of replacing traditional finance.
Is that good or bad?
I see both sides. I do. I think what will be really interesting is I think it's a matter of years before we start seeing big financial institutions merging into the crypto space and it becoming one. And that's a good thing if you are looking for mass adoption and more embracing of the industry. It will, like you're saying, sort of lead to this increased surveillance, and that's something we all need to work on. I think everyone on this panel works to discuss this with regulators, because for some reason, regulators, when they hear crypto and privacy, they think crime. And those things should not, I mean, there are legitimate reasons why people want financial privacy that have nothing to do with tax evasion, money laundering, or illicit, terrorist financing.
Yeah.
I think Hailey raises a great point, too, around the ecosystem, right? So we're focused purely on the peer-to-peer element of Bitcoin. And at the same time, we want the Bitcoin economy, the Bitcoin community, the layer 2 elements that are being built on top of Bitcoin to grow, right? And there is always this push and pull between more money in Bitcoin makes, boats float, right?
Yep.
The bigger the boat, the less the wake. And so there is this kind of push and pull between the traditional financial ecosystem and the Bitcoin ecosystem that, the two should remain separate. But in the same breath, people will say, well, when are we going to get a Bitcoin ETF? I'll tell you. When we solve some of the market instability and some of the market manipulation that we have inherent within a nascent industry. It's still quite young. And so there's some stuff that goes on that then prevents policymakers from feeling comfortable. And so there, would I love for Bitcoin to just be completely not isolated, but sovereign from everything and be able to achieve that on its own? Of course. But I just don't see that happening without some coalescence between the two.
Jeff, I'm going to give you the last word because we're actually pretty close to time.
I think we're at a good inflection point. You brought up the Bank Secrecy Act, which came out in the 1970s. And some of those rules have not changed yet. And our regulators are trying to apply banking standards to a white paper, and it just doesn't fit. Right? We had a fixed amount of $10,000 for a currency transaction report. in 1970. With inflation, that's like a $40,000 number, and if we print another 1.9 trillion, those numbers don't mean anything if they're trying to find money launderers and terrorists. So we need to find a way to modernize some of our regulations to meet where crypto has the potential to go, and hopefully those conversations and that partnership will get us there.
Yeah, I've always said that I wish they'd peg the currency transaction report threshold to the price of Bitcoin, because then we'd get fewer and fewer. If it's going up, that is. All right, please thank our panel of esteemed legal experts in Bitcoin law.
Thank you.